Hello everyone, and thank you for being here for a reading of A Rose for Emily, written by William Faulkner. This video starts with an original summary and analysis of the story created by me to be in line with YouTube's content policy, so I'm calling out the timestamp for the audiobook itself. The audiobook for the short story, A Rose for Emily, written by William Faulkner, starts at the timestamp 42 minutes and 50 seconds. Minute mark. You can also use the YouTube chapter navigation embedded in the video and in the description below. So in this way, the length of my original summary and analysis matches or exceeds the length of the reading, thereby adding significant commentary alongside the educational value of giving an original performance of the reading. There will be one more point of analysis following the reading of the audiobook as well. If this video helped you, or if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me to be able to keep supporting you all. If you have any requests for short stories or poetry or summaries and analyses, please let me know in the comments. And just dropping a comment to say thanks or hi also greatly helps me out. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. Stay lit with Simply Lit. Let's start with our summary of A Rose for Emily. William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, written in 1930, is a Southern Gothic short story that explores themes of isolation, resistance to change, and the grotesque consequences of clinging to the past. The story is told through a collective first-person narrator representing the townspeople of Jefferson, Mississippi. The non-chronological structure heightens the suspense, revealing key details and fragmented glimpses before culminating in a shocking final revelation. The story begins with the death of Miss Emily Grierson, an aging recluse from an old Southern family. The entire town attends her funeral, but for different reasons. Quote, "When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument. The women, mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house. Emily's home, once a symbol of grandeur, has fallen into severe neglect. Quote, it was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, set on what had once been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the most august names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps. This description establishes Emily as a relic of the past, resisting the relentless modernization of Jefferson. Her home, like her, refuses to adapt, existing in stubborn and coquettish decay. Years before her death, the town attempted to collect taxes from Emily. Unbeknownst to the new officials, the former mayor, Colonel Sartoris, had fabricated a story to relieve Emily of this financial burden. Quote, only a man of Colonel Sartoris' generation thought it could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. When city representatives visit Emily's home, they find her unchanged, her presence evoking an eerie, almost cadaverous quality. Quote, she looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue. Despite their insistence, Emily remains unwavering, dismissing their demands with an air of superiority. Quote, see, Colonel Sartoris, I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris, however, has been dead for a decade, underscoring Emily's complete detachment from reality. Her refusal to acknowledge the passage of time becomes a defining trait. As a young woman, Emily lived under the control of her father, a rigid aristocrat who believed no man was good enough for his daughter. His dominance left her socially isolated and socially stunted. Quote, we remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. When he dies, Emily initially refuses to accept her father's death. For 3 days, she insists her father is still alive. Quote, she told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her, and the doctors trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. Only after the pressure becomes unbearable does she concede, allowing his burial. This incident foreshadows her later, even more extreme refusal to let go of Homer Barron. Not long after her father's death, Emily is seen in the company of Homer Barron, a northern foreman overseeing construction in Jefferson. The town initially welcomes this development, believing it signals a fresh start for Emily. Quote, "At first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, 'Of course a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day laborer.' But as their courtship continues, the town's attitude shifts. The idea of a southern aristocrat associating with a working-class northerner disturbs traditional sensibilities. Furthermore, Homer himself is known to be uninterested in marriage. Quote, 'She will marry him,' we said. And then we said, 'She will persuade him yet,' because Homer himself had remarked he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. The subtle suggestion and implication about Homer's sexuality, or his simply uninterested quality in a traditional relationship, adds complexity to Emily's growing desperation and her need to cling to him as he is appearing to be slipping out of her hands. Speculation intensifies on the complicated nature and all the different feelings associated with it when Emily visits a local druggist and demands poison. When asked what kind of poison she wants, she says, "I don't care, just the best kind." The druggist provides arsenic, marking the package, quote, "for rats." The town assumes she plans to commit suicide, quote, "So the next day we all said, she will kill herself, and we said it would be the best thing." The townspeople's cold acceptance of Emily's supposed self-destruction reflects their detached, almost voyeuristic interest in her life rather than any real concern. Homer is last seen entering Emily's home one evening and then he vanishes. Emily, in turn, withdraws completely from public view. Quote, "From that time on, her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years when she gave lessons in china painting. Her physical appearance continues to change, reflecting both aging and increasing detachment from the outside world." Quote, "When we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat, and her hair was turning gray." Soon after Homer's disappearance, a terrible odor began to emanate from Emily's house. The town, reluctant to confront her, took matters into their own hands. Quote, "They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. After a week or two, the smell went away." Their indirect approach to handling the situation mirrors their overall attitude toward Emily, preferring silent observation to a direct confrontation with the force that is Emily. And after Emily's death, the townspeople finally entered a sealed room upstairs in her house. Inside, they find a chilling scene. Quote, "A thin, acrid pall as of a tomb seemed to lie everywhere upon this room decked and furnished as for a bridal. On the bed lies the long decayed corpse of Homer Barron." Quote, "The man himself lay in the bed. Beside him, a second pillow bears a disturbing imprint." The overall punchline or horror line of the story, quote, "Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair." Right, and this is Emily's hair, often referred to as iron gray in the story. And so it becomes obvious that Emily has been sleeping next to the body of Homer Barron all these years as her hair is getting caught in the pillows, and the man himself is, or what's left of him, is in the bed lying next to her. So, this final revelation confirms that Emily, unwilling to let go of Homer, poisoned him and kept his body in her bedroom, where she lay beside him for years, just for a little cuddle or two, or many cuddles every day. A Rose for Emily is a haunting meditation on love, loss, and the extreme lengths to which a person might go to preserve what they cannot bear to lose. This all spurred by a patriarchal society and culture that is based more in tradition rather than in common sense and individual liberty. The social pressure, the town, which reinforces her father's attitudes, ultimately causes Emily's doom and to spiral into the insane, crypt-keeping cuddler that she becomes. Faulkner's chilling final image of the iron gray hair lingers long after the story ends, ensuring Emily Grierson's place as one of literature's most unforgettable tragic figures. And again, right, this is all due to the pressure Emily could not escape until she could escape it by transgressing and just going completely over the head of tradition, of culture, of norms, and forging her own reality where she could finally be happy. As morbid of a conclusion as that may be, she found power in doing what she did to Homer and making him her husband in the end, finally and forever. Now that we've done a summary, let's dig into our analysis, starting with a great place to start with any story, a character analysis. So, like we've talked about, Rose for Emily has these themes of isolation, resistance to change, and psychological decay, and Emily Grierson, the tragic protagonist, embodies the Old South's decline, while characters like Homer Barron and the collective townspeople serve as mirrors to her fate. Through rich symbolism and fragmented narration, Faulkner crafts a chilling tale of love, loss, and madness, culminating in that shocking reveal that we discussed prior. So, with that in mind, let's dig more specifically into these characters, who they are, and how to read them and analyze them. In terms of Emily Grierson, our protagonist, essentially, and the person who the story centers around, from the very first description of Emily, she is portrayed as an anachronism, right? Someone out of time. Quote, "Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town." The phrase, hereditary obligation, suggests that the town does not see Emily as an individual, but as a lingering artifact of the antebellum South. Scholar John Skinner argues that Emily represents, quote, "the Old South's inability to adapt to modernity," emphasizing how she clings to outdated traditions in a world that has left her behind. Her home, once grand but now decaying, mirrors both her physical and emotional deterioration. Quote, "It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps." Critic Ray West Jr. interprets Emily's house as a, quote, "metaphor for the decaying aristocracy of the South." The use of the word coquettish suggests that Emily, like her house, is pretending to maintain its former grandeur despite being in ruins. Faulkner himself spoke about the enduring theme of decay in his work, particularly in his novel The Sound and the Fury. Quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." This reflection on the inescapability of the past sheds light on Emily's inability to break free from the decaying traditions of the South. The crumbling house and Emily's stagnant existence illustrate this theme vividly, as she is trapped in a moment in time, unable to evolve as the world around her does. Furthermore, Emily's isolation and forced seclusion and psychological decline are other key elements of her character. Emily's forced seclusion begins under the oppressive rule of her father, who rejects all her potential suitors. Quote, "We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily, a slender figure in white in the background, her father, a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip." This imagery is deeply revealing. Emily is visually positioned as secondary to her father, trapped in a tableau, frozen in time. Scholar Judith Federley interprets this scene as an example of patriarchal dominance, arguing that Emily's lack of autonomy over her romantic life ultimately leaves her emotionally and psychologically underdeveloped. When her father dies, Emily refuses to acknowledge it. Quote, "She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days." Clance Brooks, another literary critic, suggests that this moment is emblematic of Emily's larger rejection of reality. She refuses to accept change, whether it be personal loss, social progress, or the passage of time itself. Faulkner himself said of his writing process and his characters, quote, I give them the old love of the past, the inability to move on, the things they would rather not face, because it is those things that affect them the most. This captures Emily's psychological state precisely. Her refusal to let go of the past affects her deeply, causing her to hold on to illusions rather than confront the difficult truths of loss and change. Emily's relationship with Homer Barron is another key component to understand about Emily, and Homer Barron, a northern laborer, is one of the most controversial aspects of the story. Homer is a charismatic yet fundamentally transient figure, quote, a Yankee, a big, dark, ready man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. Scholar Eric Sundquist suggests that Homer represents modernity and the industrial North, intruding upon the stagnant world of the Old South. This makes his courtship with Emily all the more paradoxical. He is a force of change, while she is a symbol of resistance. However, Homer himself is not interested in marriage. Quote, Homer himself had remarked he liked men. It was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Some scholars, including James M. Millard, have interpreted this line as a subtle suggestion that Homer may be homosexual, making his relationship with Emily even more doomed from the start. When Emily realizes that Homer may leave her, she takes drastic action, purchasing arsenic with chilling decisiveness. Her lack of hesitation suggests a psychological break. She no longer sees love as something mutual, but as something that must be possessed. Toni Morrison interprets Emily's decision to kill Homer as a desperate assertion of control in a life where she had been perpetually powerless. Faulkner spoke often about the human capacity for fear and obsession in relationships. Quote, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. As Faulkner tries to highlight here, Emily's tragic journey with Homer Barron is a manifestation of this very conflict, her deep need for companionship, warped by her fear of abandonment and her inability to let go of the past. This internal struggle leads her to take the ultimate horrific step to maintain control. The final revelation is one of the most haunting moments in literature. Quote, the body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace. Literary critic Joseph Blochner suggests that this final image represents Emily's ultimate defiance of time and death and culture and society. By keeping Homer's body, she freezes him in a permanent state of togetherness, preventing the inevitable abandonment she feared. In terms of Homer Barron specifically, and taking a moment to analyze him, we can see Homer as a symbol of the modern North. This is because Homer Barron is a Yankee laborer who is in stark contrast to the genteel Southern aristocrats Emily would have traditionally married. His presence signals the arrival of modernization. However, in Homer's examples and what the town people say, he has said, invokes sort of casual racism that reflects the changing racial dynamics of the post-Civil War South. Scholar David Minter suggests that Homer's characterization as a brash, working-class Northerner illustrates Faulkner's critique of the myth that the North was inherently more progressive than the South. Homer also represents a departure from the expected Southern gentleman who would have been Emily's match. Faulkner's portrayal of Homer as an outsider, both socially and geographically, further complicates the notion of traditional Southern values. The fact that Homer is from the North signifies a dissonance with Emily's upbringing, a symbol of the social changes and cultural conflicts during the post-Civil War era. When Homer vanishes, the town assumes he left. Quote, that was the last we saw of Homer Barron. This casual dismissal by the townspeople mirrors their tendency to ignore problems rather than confront them. Scholar John Matthews suggests that the town's failure to question Homer's disappearance underscores their complicity in Emily's actions. They prefer to let the matter fade into obscurity rather than deal with uncomfortable truths. As Homer becomes a victim of Emily's psychosis, he is not just an individual figure lost in a relationship. His fate represents the sacrifices that individuals in a changing society must make as they become trapped in the inevitable conflict between tradition and modernity. Homer, symbolizing the present and future, is unable to survive in a world dominated by the forceful clinging to the past that Emily represents. Now let's look at the townspeople, the narrators themselves, as a sort of collective character. The town functions essentially as a collective voice of judgment and inaction and a preservation and record keeper of the memory of this culture, this antiquated culture that's fading out of fashion as the time goes on towards modernity. And so the townspeople act as an omnipresent but passive force in Emily's life. Their fascination with her is both respectful and voyeuristic. Quote, "When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women, mostly out of curiosity." Diana Roberts argues that this passage reveals the town's hypocrisy. They see Emily as both a relic to be honored and a spectacle to be gossiped about. The townspeople dual role as both participants and spectators of Emily's downfall suggests their passive complicity. In this sense, they serve as a representation of societal inertia. They watch Emily's life unravel, and they are largely the cause of it due to all their cultural norms and that informing and influencing her father's possessive and controlling nature in a patriarchal culture. Yet they never intervene nor provide the support that Emily so desperately needed. This inaction and upholding of tradition reflects Faulkner's criticism of Southern society's failure to confront its issues head-on and the consequences, which are dire, of such neglect. The town also plays this key role in Emily's tragedy. Instead of confronting Emily about the smell coming from her house, for example, they take secretive measures to cover it up. So, right, they're just ready to be complicit at all because they don't want to talk about anything and keep everything looking nice on the surface, is in line with the traditional Southern culture where they don't acknowledge all these things that are in the dark underbelly of their culture and their town and the society and the toxic and problematic cultural customs they enforce, especially as it comes to gender and submission of women. And so, right, they just sneak onto Emily's property to help cover this tragedy up. Quote, "They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there, and in all the outbuildings." Scholar Brooks Thomas suggests that this act symbolizes the town's broader tendency, again, to support these uncomfortable truths. This event highlights this broader theme of moral complacency in the town. The townspeople acknowledge something is wrong. Emily is perhaps breaking societal norms, as well as many other things she's breaking, but they choose to act privately, choosing silence over confrontation. This avoidance of responsibility, of accountability for the direct state that Emily is in, reinforces Faulkner's critique of a society that turns a blind eye to its own moral decay. The town also functions as a collective form of gossip and moral judgment. Throughout the story, the townspeople provide a narrative driven by gossip and moral judgment. They become the eyes of the community, analyzing Emily's life from a distance. Quote, "We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she had come to a point where she had to choose someone." Here, the townspeople rationalize Emily's action as an inevitable consequence of her father's overbearing influence and their own collective ignorance. While they speculate on her mental state, they fail to understand the complexity of her emotional need. Their collective judgment becomes another form of exile for Emily, who already lives in isolation. With all these things in mind, Emily herself, the townspeople, Homer, Emily Grierson becomes one of literature's most haunting figures, shaped by forces beyond her control, yet ultimately responsible for her horrifying actions. Whether seen as a victim of patriarchal oppression, a symbol of the South's decline, or a woman asserting control in the only way she knows how, she remains an unforgettable character. As Faulkner once remarked, "I'm not interested in the past. I'm interested in the present and the future, because the past is always there." Emily's tragedy is that she is incapable of moving beyond the past, unable to find a place in the future. Her inability to escape the weight of history, both personal and societal, ultimately condemns her to a life of madness. Through Gothic elements, fragmented storytelling, and an unsettling final revelation, A Rose for Emily forces readers to confront these consequences of repression, isolation, and the unwavering grip of the past as embodied by Emily. Now that we've analyzed character in the story, let's discuss some of the key themes of A Rose for Emily. Looking at it from a bird's eye view, Faulkner's thematic exploration brings to the forefront questions about the past, social change, identity, and the tragic consequences of isolation. These themes are explored through the central character of Emily, whose personal decline is intertwined with the decline of the Old South. Decay and the inescapable passage of time is one key theme, and this is one of those central and pervasive themes, which is of decay. The imagery of decay is present throughout the story, both in Emily herself and in her surroundings, symbolizing the decline of the Old South and its values. Emily's home, once a grand monument to Southern aristocracy, is now a decaying relic, reflecting the inescapable nature of time and change. Quote, "It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the Victorian style, with a lot of cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies which had once been white. The house was decayed, its lawn a riot of weeds, and the very sight of it, in contrast to its one grand appearance, mirrors a southern aristocracy's decaying status." This description of the house reveals the physical deterioration of both Emily and the Southern societal structure she represents. Scholar David W. Davies notes that the house symbolizes Emily's own stagnation. Quote, "The house, like Emily, refuses to change, but both are crumbling under the weight of their own irrelevance." The decaying house is not just a metaphor for Emily's isolation, but also representative of the societal forces that trapped her in the past. The Old South, like the house, is losing its relevance and being overtaken by a new modern world. Emily's refusal to let go of the past is evident in how she clings to her decaying home, unable to embrace the changes around her. In a 1955 interview, Faulkner remarked on this theme of decay, "The past is never dead, it's not even the past." And this quote is again crucial in understanding Emily's predicament, Faulkner emphasizing the weight of the past, particularly in the context of the Southern way of life, which refuses to die even when it's long obsolete. Emily's life is defined by this stubborn refusal to confront the inevitable passage of time, which results in her physical and psychological decay. Isolation and the psychological consequences of repression is another key theme as well. Emily Grierson's isolation is both a personal choice and a product of the society around her. From her father's oppressive control to her eventual complete withdrawal from the world, Emily's life is marked by intense seclusion. This isolation fuels her psychological decline, which culminates in the macabre act of keeping Homer Barron's body in her home. Quote, "She was a small, fat woman, and in the late 1800s, her house was large and decayed. The townspeople would gossip about her as they passed by, but as years went on, she began to fade into the background of town life. She was an enigma, constantly reclusive, her life filled with mystery." Emily's seclusion allows for her distorted perceptions of reality. John Matthews argues that Emily's isolation creates a psychological prison where she becomes unable to reconcile her desires with reality. This is particularly evident in her refusal to acknowledge the death of her father, holding on to the illusion that he is still alive. Quote, "She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days." Faulkner's portrayal of Emily's refusal to acknowledge death is a significant thematic moment. Scholar Judith Federley suggests that Emily's act of denial stems from an overwhelming sense of loss and a desperate attempt to cling to the only constant in her life, her father. For Emily, the past is not just a memory, but a present reality that she cannot bear to face. Faulkner himself, when discussing his writing, often pointed to the psychological complexities of his character. Quote, "I give them the old love of the past, the inability to move on, the things they would rather not face, because it is those things that affected them most." Emily is a perfect embodiment of this sentiment. She's unable to face her father's death and later the reality of Homer's rejection, leading her to an extreme act of psychological denial. The resistance to change and the clash between tradition and modernity is yet another key theme. Emily, as representative of the Old South, is caught in a time warp, resisting the social and economic changes occurring in her town. Her world is being overtaken by industrialization, urbanization, and shifting social dynamics, yet she remains obstinately attached to a decaying aristocratic way of life. Quote, "The next generations, with its machines and ambitions, began to overtake the town, but Miss Emily Grierson was still a tradition. The town had always looked upon her as the last vestige of the Old South, a relic." In this quote, Faulkner draws a sharp contrast between the burgeoning modern world and Emily's outdated values. Critic Ray West Jr. comments on this dynamic, asserting that Emily represents a dying breed of Southern nobility, unable to reconcile with the growing presence of the North and industrializations. Faulkner's own perspective on change is evident in his commentary on the South's struggle to adapt. Quote, The South will always try to maintain its old values, no matter how much the world changes around it. Faulkner's critique is quite clear. Emily's life is a tragic reflection of the South's inability to move forward, leading to a painful and violent attachment to the past. Another theme, the theme of love, obsession, and possession, comes up in its different forms. In this case, it's a twisted form of love that morphs into an obsession, which is this prominent theme in the story. Emily's relationship with Homer Barron is initially marked by a sense of romantic longing, which eventually deteriorates into possession and then into violence when Emily can no longer bear the thought of losing him, as when she asks for some poison. In that moment, when Emily asks for the poison at the drugstore that she gets, the arsenic, Emily seeks to ensure Homer's permanence in her life, even if it means getting rid of him forever. Well, not getting rid of him, but making it so he can't run away anymore and just has to stay in bed with her forever. Toni Morrison interprets this act as a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable, arguing that Emily's desire for Homer is less about love and more about possession. The poison represents Emily's refusal to let go, her inability to accept Homer's autonomy, and her desire to keep him in a permanent, lifeless embrace. Emily's obsession with Homer Barron reveals a darker, more pathological side of love, one that borders on madness. Her emotional dependency on Homer, compounded by her extreme isolation, drives her to commit this unspeakable act to secure his love, or how she sees as his love, for the rest of her life. As James M. Millard, a critic, observes, quote, Emily does not seek affection from Homer, but rather dominance over him, an interpretation that refrains her love as a destructive force rather than a nurturing one. But it makes sense. She has been under the thumb of power structures from her father to the town to the larger culture to the larger Old South for all her life. Now, when she can finally establish some act of defiance and agency, she takes a chance to do so. Death, loss, and the inability to let go is also a key theme. The theme of death is central to the narrative, not only in the literal sense, the death of Emily's father, Homer Barron, and ultimately Emily herself, but also as a metaphor for Emily's refusal to allow change or to release the hold she has over the past. Quote, when Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women mostly out of curiosity. This moment at the end of the story underscores the idea that Emily's death marks the final dissolution of the Old South, but it is also a death of the community's own illusions about her. Scholar William Van O'Connor suggests that Emily's life and death are symbolic of the South's inability to let go, even when it is already decayed beyond recognition. William Faulkner spoke about this theme of death in his work as well. Quote, in every human heart, there's a thing that is the universal part, the thing that is the same in all of us. This is the part that accepts that death is inevitable, and it is in this that Emily Grierson's tragedy resides. Faulkner emphasizes that Emily's tragic flaw lies in her refusal to accept the inevitability of death, not just the death of others, but also the death of herself and her place in the world. This refusal ultimately leads her to preserve Homer's body as a way of halting the passage of time and preventing the loss of control she so fears. Again, she is finally able to exhibit some form of control over her life. And so, through A Rose for Emily, Faulkner explores these powerful, often destructive influence of the past on the present. Emily Grierson's tragic life is a reflection of the larger South, unable to release itself from the past and ultimately destroyed by its own inertia. Her psychological decay, fueled by isolation, repression, and a refusal to accept change, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of living in a time that has already passed. Faulkner's own reflections on time and history provide crucial insights into the story's themes. Quote, the past is not dead, it is never even past. In A Rose for Emily, the past is a force that shapes and eventually crushes its characters. The town, Emily, and even Homer Barron are all products of a history that they cannot escape, no matter how hard they try. This tragic inescapability of time and change is the central theme of this story by Faulkner, making it a timeless meditation on the human condition. Now that we've talked about Analyzing some of the themes and the characters, let's analyze another key component of story, which is setting, and particularly place as character. And so, in A Rose for Emily, Faulkner uses place not merely as a backdrop, but as an active and integral character that shapes the lives and fates of the individuals within it. The setting in this Southern Gothic short story is not just a passive environment, it reflects the psychological states of the characters and the societal conditions that define their existence. The physical place, the decaying town of Jefferson, and Emily's deteriorating home, act as mirrors for the personal and collective decay of its inhabitants, especially Emily Grierson. Faulkner's depiction of place underscores the interplay between individual identities and the surrounding environment, emphasizing the complex and sometimes destructive relationship between the individual and their environment. Let's look at the town of Jefferson as an extension of its inhabitants. The fictional town of Jefferson, set in the South, is essential to understanding the dynamics of A Rose for Emily. Faulkner's choice to make the town itself an active character illustrates the way in which Emily, her family, and the entire Southern community are inexorably tied to the place they inhabit. The town is steeped in tradition, history, and decay, much like Emily herself. The townspeople represent a microcosm of the larger Southern society, trapped between the reverence for the past and the necessity of moving forward towards a modern world. Quote, "The town had just let the whole thing go, but the townspeople still regarded Miss Emily with a sort of awe and curiosity, and they had allowed her to live out her life in complete isolation." This quote shows the town's ambivalence towards Emily. They tolerate her eccentricities, partly out of respect for her family's former prominence, and partly because of a mix of curiosity and reverence for the past. Faulkner's decision to give the town such a significant role, almost as if it were observing Emily's tragic decline from a distance, suggests that the town itself is stuck in time, unable or willing to confront the realities of Emily's, and by extension, its own situation. The town represents the Old South, which is stagnant and slowly decaying in the face of modernization. In critic Hugh M. Whitmire's analysis, he notes that Jefferson is both the physical and ideological graveyard of the Old South, a place where the values of tradition, honor, and societal status are slowly dying. Faulkner uses Jefferson as a place that embodies the tension between the past and present. The town's reluctance to interfere in Emily's life and the passive acceptance of her decline suggests a community unwilling to confront the disintegration of its old values and the inherent problems that came with them in this toxic culture. This inertia mirrors Emily's own refusal to change as she continues to live in a house that is literally falling apart around her. Jefferson's collective unwillingness to change contrasts with the rapidly modernizing world outside its borders, and Emily is its last decaying representative. In this sense, the town of Jefferson functions almost like an incubator for Emily's stagnant life. Let's talk about Emily's home in particular, which is a symbol of isolation and decay. And this is because Emily's home is arguably the most significant place in the story, acting as both literal and metaphorical representation of Emily's psychological state. As a character, the house plays a pivotal role in illustrating the passage of time and the consequences of holding on to the past. The home itself, with its decaying architecture and contrast between faded grandeur and dilapidation, embodies the tension between Emily's desire to preserve the past and the inevitability of change. The house, much like Emily, is stuck in a moment in time, right? The architecture is, like it says in the quote, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the Victorian style, which lots of cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies, which had once been white, is a sort of satirical statement in saying, like, this house is out of time. It was once beautiful and grand, but its decline parallels Emily's own physical and mental deterioration. John T. Matthews, another literary scholar, argues that the house, with its sprawling and decaying structure, symbolizes the collapse of the Southern aristocracy that Emily represents. The house was once a symbol of wealth, privilege, and social status, but now it is merely a shell of the former self, mirroring Emily's tragic refusal to accept the passage of time. The house also serves as a prison for Emily. She is trapped within its walls, unable to escape her own mental constraints or the expectations of the town. Her inability to interact meaningfully with the outside world is reflected in her home's isolation from the town. Both physically, it is on the corner that separates it from the more developed areas of Jefferson, and metaphorically. Just as Emily's emotional and social life is stagnated, so too is the house. It symbolizes the oppressive weight of Southern traditions and social structures that have have not evolved to accommodate new realities. Faulkner's use of home as a metaphor for Emily's mental state reveals his deep understanding of place as a psychological construct. The house is not merely where Emily lives, it is a part of who she is, an expression of her internal world, a representation of what she is unwilling to confront. Let's talk about some scholarly perspectives on place in the story, more in depth. Faulkner's use of place has long been a subject of critical interest. Several scholars have commented on the profound role that place plays in shaping both the characters' lives and the story itself. And particularly, scholars note the southern landscape in Faulkner's work, which is often presented as a reflection of internal turmoil, societal conflict, and personal disintegration. Hugh M. Whitmer, in his analysis of Faulkner's southern settings, writes, quote, "The settings in Faulkner's work are not merely a backdrop, but an active, almost sentient force that shapes the lives and destinies of the characters. Jefferson, and Emily's house in particular, is an embodiment of the Old South, trapped in its own historical moment, struggling to make sense of the present." Whitmer's assertion is crucial to understanding Faulkner's thematic element of place. In A Rose for Emily, Jefferson and Emily's house serve as mirrors to Emily's emotional state, creating a sense of claustrophobia and inevitable doom. The town and its inhabitants are trapped in the past as Emily is trapped in her decaying home. Barbara Ladd, in her essay on Faulkner's spatial dynamics, argues that the setting of Faulkner's work often, quote, acts as both a character and a mirror, reflecting the psychological and social forces at play. She contends that the setting in A Rose for Emily allows Faulkner to explore the disintegration of the Southern myth with its emphasis on tradition, honor, and social hierarchy. The house, in particular, is an expression of these forces, slowly falling apart as Emily clings to the past. Both scholars here agree that Faulkner uses place not as a mere backdrop, but as an essential part of the story's psychological and thematic structure. The town of Jefferson and Emily's house both represent a South that refuses to let go of its past, despite the inevitable forces of change that threaten it. The physical decay of these places is inseparable from the emotional and mental decay of their inhabitants, particularly Emily. Faulkner's own reflection on place provide additional insights into his narrative choices for A Rose for Emily and setting and place. In a 1954 interview, Faulkner said, "Place is not just where the characters exist, it is where they become what they are. It shapes them, confines them, or frees them. In the case of Emily, the house is as much a character as she is." Faulkner's comment underscores the central role that place plays in his storytelling. For Emily, her home is a confinement, a place where she cannot escape the ghosts of her past, nor can she escape the changes happening outside its walls. She can neither escape nor accept those changes. The house is both a sanctuary and a prison, reflecting the tension between safety and suffocation. Thus, in A Rose for Emily, the town of Jefferson and Emily's decaying home are not just setting, they are vital active characters in the story. They shape the lives of the characters, mirror their psychological states, and represent the broader societal forces at work in the South. Faulkner's use of place as character allows him to explore these themes of decay, isolation, resistance to change, and the consequences of clinging to the past. As a writer deeply connected to his Southern roots, Faulkner illustrates how place is not merely an external reality, but a defining force that shapes the identity and fate of its inhabitants. Through Faulkner's nuanced depiction of place, we see that the boundaries between physical space and personal identity are porous, and the environment in which one exists has the powers to shape and even determine the course of one's life. Now, please enjoy the audiobook portion of this video for a reading and original performance of A Rose for Emily, written by William Faulkner.
1. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument. The women mostly out of curiosity to see inside her house, which no one save an old man-servant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years. It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white and decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. And now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names where they lay in the cedar, bemused cemetery among the ranked and anonymous graves of Union and Confederate soldiers who fell at the Battle of Jefferson. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the date of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. Only a man of Colonel Sartoris's generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. On the first of the year, they mailed her a tax notice. February came and there was no reply. They wrote her a formal letter, asking her to call at the sheriff's office at her convenience. A week later, the mayor wrote her himself, offering to call or send his car for her, and received in reply a note on paper of an archaic shape, in a thin, flowing calligraphy in faded ink, to the effect that she no longer went out at all. The tax notice was also enclosed, without comment. They called a special meeting of the Board of Aldermen. A deputation waited upon her, knocked at the door, though which no visitor had passed since she ceased giving china painting lessons 8 or 10 years earlier. They were admitted by the old Negro into a dim hall from which a stairway mounted into still more shadow. It smelled of dust and disuse, a close, dank smell. The Negro led them into the parlor. It was furnished in a heavy leather-covered furniture. When the Negro opened the blinds of one window, they could see that the leather was cracked, and when they sat down, a faint dust rose sluggishly above their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sun ray. On a tarnished gilt easel before this fireplace stood a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. They rose when she entered, a small, fat woman in black, with a thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt, leaning on an ebony cane with a tarnished gold head. Her skeleton was small and spare. Perhaps that was why, with what would have been merely plumpness in another, was obesity in her. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like 2 small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough as they moved from one face to another while the visitors stated their errand. She did not ask them to sit. She just stood in the door and listened quietly until the spokesman came to a stumbling halt. Then they could hear the invisible watch ticking at the end of the gold chain. Her voice was dry and cold. "I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris explained it to me. Perhaps one of you can gain access to the city records and satisfy yourselves." "But we have. We are the city authorities, Miss Emily. Didn't you get a notice from the sheriff, signed by him?" "I received a paper, yes," Miss Emily said. "Perhaps he considers himself the sheriff. I have no taxes in Jefferson." "But there's nothing on the books to show that. You see, we must go by the—" "See Colonel Sartoris. I have no taxes in Jefferson." "But, Miss Emily—" "See Colonel Sartoris." Colonel Sartoris had been dead almost 10 years. "I have no taxes in Jefferson." "Toby!" The Negro appeared. "Show these gentlemen out." 2. So she vanquished them, horse and foot, and just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. That was 2 years after her father's death and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. After her father's death, she went out very little, and after her sweetheart went away, people hardly saw her at all. A few of the ladies had the temerity to call, but were not received, and the only sign of life about the place was a Negro man, a young man then, going in and out with a market basket. "Just as if any man could keep a kitchen properly," the lady said. So they were not surprised when the smell developed. It was another link between the gross, teeming world and the high and mighty Griersons. A neighbor, a woman, complained to the mayor, Judge Stevens, 80 years old. "But what will you have me do about it, madame?" he said. "Why, send a word to stop it," the woman said. "Isn't there a law?" "I'm sure that won't be necessary," Judge Stevens said. "It's probably just a snake or rat and that nigger of hers killed in the yard. I'll speak to him about it." The next day he received 2 more complaints, one from a man who came in different deprecation. "We really must do something about it, Judge. I'd be the last one in the world to bother Miss Emily, but we gotta do something." That night the Board of Aldermen met, 3 graybeards and 1 younger man, a member of the rising generation. "It's simple enough," he said. "Send her word to have a place cleaned up, and give her a certain time to do it in, and if she don't—" "Damn it, sir," Judge Stevens said, "will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad?" So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn into the shadow of locusts that lined the street. After a week or 2, the smell went away. And that was when people had begun to really feel sorry for her. And people in our town, remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great-aunt, had gone completely crazy at last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily, a slender figure in white in the background, her father, a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the 2 of them framed by the back, flung front door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. Even with the insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all her chances if they had really materialized. When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her, and in a way people were glad. At least they could pity Miss Emily. Being left alone and a pauper, she had become dehumanized. Now she too would know the old thrill and the old despair of a penny, more or less. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid. As is our custom, Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual and with no trace of grief on her face. She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her and the doctors trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. And just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down, and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. 3. She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl, with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. The town had just left the contracts for paving the sidewalks. In the summer after her father's death, they began the work. The construction company came with riggers and mules and machinery and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ready man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the riggers, and the riggers sing in time to the rise and fall of picks. Pretty soon he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sundays driving the yellow-wheeled buggy in the matched team of bays from the livery stable. At first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, of course a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day laborer. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige, without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily, her kinsfolk should come to her. She had some kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of old Lady Wyatt, a crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. And as soon as the old people said, "Poor Emily," the whispering began. "Do you suppose it's really so?" they said to one another. "Of course it is. What else could?" This behind their hands, rustling of crane silk and satin behind jealousy closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoon as the thin, swift clop, clop, clop of the matched teams passed. Poor Emily. She carried her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson, as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. Like when she bought the rat poison and the arsenic. That was over a year after they had begun to say, "Poor Emily," and while the two female cousins were visiting her. "I want some poison," she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes and a face the flesh of which was strained across the temple and about the eye socket, as you imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. "I want some poison," she said. "Yes, Miss Emily, what kind? For rats and such, I'd recommend." "I want the best you have. I don't care what kind." The druggist named several. "They'll kill anything up to an elephant, but what you want is arsenic," Miss Emily said. "Is that a good one?" "Is arsenic? Yes, ma'am, but what you want?" "I want arsenic." The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. "Why, of course," the druggist said, "if that's what you want. But the law requires you to tell me what you're going to use it for." Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look at him eye for eye, until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. The Negro delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and bones, "For rats." 4. So the next day we all said, "She will kill herself," and we said it would be the best thing. When she had first begun to be seen with Homer Barron, we had said, "She will marry him." Then we said, "She will persuade him yet." Because Homer himself had remarked, he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Later we said, "Poor Emily." Behind the jalousies as they passed on Sunday afternoon in the glittering buggy, Miss Emily with her head high and Homer Barron with his hat cocked and a cigar in his teeth, reins and whip in a yellow glove. Then some of the ladies began to say it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister, Miss Emily's people were Episcopal, to call upon her. He would never divulge what happened during that interview, but he refused to go back again. The next Sunday, they again drove about the streets, and the following day the minister's wife wrote to Miss Emily's relations in Alabama. So she had blood, kin under a roof again, and we sat back to watch developments. At first nothing happened. Then we were sure that they were to be married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver, with the letters HB on each piece. 2 days later, we learned that she had bought a complete outfit in men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said, "They are married." We were really glad. We were glad because the two female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily had ever been. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron, the streets had been finished some time since, was gone. We were a little disappointed there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. By that time it was a cabal, and we were all Miss Emily's allies to help circumvent the cousins. Sure enough, after another week they departed, and, as we had expected all along, within 3 days Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. The Negro man went in and out with the market basket, but the front door remained closed. Now and then we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the lime, but for almost 6 months she did not appear on the streets. Then we knew that this was to be expected too, as if that quality of her father, which had thwarted a woman's life so many times, had been too virulent and too furious to die. When we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat and her hair was turning gray. During the next few years, it grew grayer and grayer until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray, and it ceased turning. Up to the day of her death at 74, it was still that vigorous iron gray, like the hair of an active man. From that time on, her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in china painting. She fitted up a studio in one of the downstairs rooms where the daughters and granddaughters of Colonel Sartoris's contemporaries were sent to her with the same regularity and the same spirit that they were sent to church on Sundays with a 25-cent piece for the collection plate. Meanwhile, her taxes had been remitted. Then the newer generations became the backbone and the spirit of the town, and the painting pupils grew up and fell away and did not send their children to her with boxes of colors and tedious brushes and pictures cut from ladies' magazines. The front door closed upon the last one and remained closed for good. When the town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. Daily, monthly, yearly, watched the Negro grow grayer and more stooped going in and out with the market basket. Each December we sent her a tax notice which would be returned by the post office a week later, unclaimed. Now and then we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house, like the carven torso of an idol in a niche, looking or not looking at us, we could never tell which. Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And so she died, fell ill in the house filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering Negro man to wait on her. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to get any information from the Negro. He talked to no one, probably not even to her, for his voice had grown harsh and rusty, as if from disuse. She died in one of the downstairs rooms, in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her gray head propped on a pillow yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight. 5. The Negro met the first of the ladies at the front door and let them in, with their hushed, sibilant voices and their quick, curious glances, and then he disappeared. He walked right through the house and out the back, and was not seen again. The 2 female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the second day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers, with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier and the ladies sibilant and macabre. And the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch and the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression, as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but, instead, a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottle neck of the most recent decade of years. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust. A thin, acrid pall, as if the tomb seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal, upon the valance curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal and the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver, silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and a tie, as if they had just been removed, which, lifted, left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit, carefully folded, beneath it the 2 mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in the bed. For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay. And upon him, and upon the pillow beside him, lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair.
Now that we've summarized the story, analyzed our story, and read our story of A Rose for Emily, let's talk about A Rose for Emily in the context of Faulkner's broader work so we can see where it fits into his writing trajectory. William Faulkner is widely regarded for his portrayal of the American South, and A Rose for Emily is often considered one of his finest examples of Southern Gothic literature. The story fits seamlessly into the broader themes and concerns of Faulkner's work, particularly in its focus of the decay of the Southern aristocracy and the complexities of time and the psychological consequences of isolation and repression. Through this lens, A Rose for Emily reflects the author's preoccupation with history, memory, and the tension between the Old South and the New South. One of the most prominent themes in Faulkner's body of work is the decline of the Old South and the social, economic, and psychological consequences of its collapse. A Rose for Emily deals directly with this theme, depicting Emily Grierson as a living symbol of the Southern aristocracy that has long since passed its prime. The story explores how Emily, and by extension the town of Jefferson, remain trapped in the past, unable to let go of a social order that has decayed. Returning to our quote from Faulkner and his preoccupation with it, right, he again said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And this quote encapsulates the themes of historical memory and its inescapable hold over the present. And thus, in A Rose for Emily, the town of Jefferson is both haunted and defined by its past, and Emily embodies this stubborn refusal to accept that the Old South has withered away. According to David W. Davies, A Rose for Emily is a clear reflection of Faulkner's broader preoccupation with the demise of Southern aristocracy. He writes, quote, "Emily is the last vestige of a dying aristocracy, a ghost who refuses to acknowledge that her time is over. This is a consistent motif throughout Faulkner's work as his characters grapple with the collapse of a once proud South." Davies' analysis here highlights how Emily's personal decline parallels the broader cultural and social collapse of the Old South. Her obsession with preserving the past, even in the face of its obvious decay, is a central theme in Faulkner's writing. Much like the characters in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, Emily's inability to accept change leads to her downfall. Another key component of this discussion is that Faulkner is often credited with being a master of Southern Gothic literature, a genre that explores the grotesque, the macabre, and the morally ambiguous within the context of the American South. A Rose for Emily is a quintessential Southern Gothic tale, marked by elements of decay, eccentricity, and psychological instability. Emily's life is filled with dark, haunting elements: her father's death, her strange relationship with Homer Barron, and her eventual act of unaliving Homer, all of which exemplify the grotesque qualities of Southern Gothic fiction. Faulkner said the following on Southern Gothic fiction, the genre, and explaining its sensibility and how it appears in his work when he said, quote, "The grotesque is always there. It's inherent in life, and in the South it's a sort of survival, the way people maintain the illusion of the greatness even while they fall apart." Faulkner's words highlight how A Rose for Emily fits neatly within his broader canon. The story, much like his other Southern Gothic works, deals with the tensions between illusion and reality, the old and the new, and the haunting presence of a past that refuses to let go. Emily's obsessive desire to hold on to her father and later Homer Barron, even in death, is emblematic of the grotesque themes Faulkner repeatedly explores in his story. John T. Matthews, another scholar, notes that Faulkner's use of the grotesque in A Rose for Emily is a defining characteristic of his work. Quote, "Emily's act of preserving Homer Barron's body is both a literal and symbolic act of violence against the natural order, a grotesque act that underscores the South's struggle to reconcile its myth with its brutal realities. Matthew's commentary underscores the way that Faulkner uses grotesque imagery in this genre to delve into the psychological and social dilemmas of his characters, particularly in the context of the Old South moral decay. Another key theme that A Rose for Emily shares with Faulkner's larger body of work is the treatment of time and memory. The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, in those works, Faulkner explores the subjectivity of time, showing how characters' perception of the past shape their present lives. In A Rose for Emily, this theme is central to Emily's tragic fate, as her refusal to let go of the past leads to her mental and physical deterioration. Faulkner had this to say on this theme of time and memory, and he frequently addressed his preoccupation with time and memory, stating, "The past is always with us, but we don't always know how to interpret it. I'm trying to show in my writing how the past lives within us, how it informs the present, whether we want it to or not." This quote is crucial to understanding A Rose for Emily. Emily's refusal to acknowledge the passage of time and the deaths in her life, including that of her father, speak to Faulkner's idea of how memory and the past can haunt the present. The entire story is a meditation on how the past, even when it is long gone, still defines the characters and their actions. Barbara Ladd, another scholar, argues that Faulkner uses the structure of A Rose for Emily to emphasize the fluidity of time in the South. Quote, Faulkner's fractured narrative structure in A Rose for Emily reflects the disjointedness of memory, as it leaps between past and present in a way that mirrors Emily's inability to let go of the past. This manipulation of time is a signature aspect of Faulkner's works, where the characters are trapped in their own histories, unable to free themselves from the weight of the past. Ladd's observations underscore how Faulkner's manipulation of time mirrors the psychological states of his characters. The non-linear narrative in A Rose for Emily reflects the confusion and distortion of time that Emily experiences as she clings to the past. In Faulkner's broader works, there is also a recurrent theme of grappling with the identity of the modern South. Faulkner's characters often confront a Southern identity that is fractured by history, social change, and internal conflict. A Rose for Emily fits into this theme by depicting Emily as a symbol of the Old South's unwillingness to embrace modernity. Her life is an embodiment of the clash between the fading traditions of the Old South and the encroaching forces of modernity, industrialization, and social change. Faulkner reflected on the South's identity crisis in his speech at the University of Virginia in 1950. Quote, "The South's great problem is that it can't get rid of the ghost of its past, the ghost of the Old South. Those codes of honor, that old way of life, continue to haunt us even as the world changes around us." This quote speaks to the heart of Emily's predicament in A Rose for Emily. She is trapped between two worlds, the decaying past she refuses to leave behind, and the modern world that continues to push forward. The townspeople, too, are caught between these two forces, unable to let go of their reverence for the Old South, yet witnessing its slow, inevitable decline. Robert W. Hamblin, another scholar, suggests that Faulkner's portrayal of Emily in A Rose for Emily reflects the modern South's struggle to reconcile its past with its present. Quote, "Emily is the embodiment of a South that cannot change, a South whose myth of grandeur and honor is at odds with the reality of its collapse. Her life is a metaphor for the South itself, stuck in a past that no longer exists." Hamlin's view reinforces Faulkner's exploration of the South's identity crisis and its inability to reconcile the nostalgia for the Old South with the realities of a changing social and economic landscape. Thus, in A Rose for Emily, Faulkner continues to explore his enduring themes that he writes about of decay, time, memory, Southern identity, Gothic Southern short storytelling as a genre and novel as well, and psychological consequences of the past. The story fits seamlessly into his broader body of work, particularly in his portrayal of the disintegration of the Old South and the conflict between tradition and modernity. Faulkner's manipulation of time, his use of Southern Gothic elements, and his examination of the psychological and social effects of historical trauma all serve to deepen the thematic complexity of the story, making it a quintessential example of Faulkner's literary concerns and the things he would like to write about. As scholars such as Davies and Ladd have noted, A Rose for Emily functions as both a reflection of Faulkner's larger body of work and a powerful standalone story that encapsulates his views on the South, history, and human nature. Through Emily Grierson's tragic fate, Faulkner examines examines the consequences of an unyielding attachment to the past and the painful realization that the South, like its decaying architecture, cannot hold as it is. If this video helped you, or if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me to be able to keep supporting you all. If you have any requests for short stories or poetry or summaries and analyses, please let me know in the comments. And just dropping a comment to say thanks or hi also greatly helps me out. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. Stay lit with Simply Lit.